I'd like to call on our first discussant, Professor David Ludden from NYU.
Oh, thank you, Sanjay. And thanks to Ashok and everyone for inviting me. This has been very interesting. I didn't come with prepared remarks, but as it turns out, the speakers have provided plenty of food for thought that I'll just chew on for about 10 minutes, and then hopefully we'll have an interesting discussion. I want to start with Professor Hughes's idea that environmental history is the study of the evolution of human relationships with nature. He refers to that theme in many different parts of his presentation, and the part of it that I was most interested in was his quote from the Chinese scholar who said that peace between humans and nature would depend upon peace among human beings, suggesting a kind of he called it an anthropocentric turn, but in other words, this idea that humans actually are the driving force in environmental history is actually an interesting idea. Dipesh Chakrabarty has recently written along those lines with the idea that finally humans have actually entered the center stage with creation of climate change, so that nature isn't out there anymore for humans to live in or adapt to, but humans are actually, in a sense, producing the environment, altering, transforming it historically in the present. I want to add or amend the ideas about environmental history a little bit to suggest that the term environmental history may be new, but the substance of environmental history is, of course, not new, because people have been studying agricultural history, transformation of environments by farming for many years. People have studied nomads and the transformation of semi-arid environments for many years. Ram Guho and his friends entered the environmental scene in an important, shall we say, disciplinary intervention in a world where people had been studying agricultural transformations of nature for a very long time under the headings of things like agrarian history, economic history, and so on. And I think that this is actually pretty important to think about the human-centered view of environmental history by focusing on this longer-term and more broadly based understanding of human transformations of nature under the heading of economic development, urbanization, and other kinds of transformations that have been going on under different headings, not called environmental history, but just called history, or called human history or social history or economic history for a long time. Environmental history in India did not begin, as Ram Guha wrongly believes, when the imperialists started marching up into the mountains. Okay. I've argued with him about this for a long time, so he and I are old pals. By the way, he was in town not too long ago. Mahesh Rangarajan will be here in the spring at some point. We'll try to pay attention to the arrival of important scholars from South Asia and let everyone know when they arrive. Chris Bailey is going to be here in the spring for a week, and he'll be doing some interesting things on British imperialism and the changing world environment then. Okay, but I want to spend the rest of my little time here talking about two themes that came up in all the talks, but I was referring to them specifically from Professor Chakrabarty and from Judith Shapiro. When we were talking about human control over nature, or human objects in nature, things in nature, particularly water, as objects of human control. Judith referred to it in terms of militaristic control, this wonderful poem that she read, making the rivers flow uphill, one of my favorite images, waging war against the earth, et cetera, these kinds of ideas. These are all ideas about power over nature, but she emphasizes, by reference to the state particularly, that these are also represent powers of humans over other humans. So that state control over nature is actually the state control over human control over nature. And so it's actually a political economy of environmental transformation is what's really at stake here. And I want to point out that this is also true in the history of capitalism. And it's not just that China is doing this, it's the market economy is doing this transformation and exerting a human power over nature for the purposes of consumption and for a primitive accumulation of natural resources. That's basically the history of capitalism. as well. And the consumption craze in China, of course, pales in significance to the long-term consumption expansion that has occurred in the West and the United States over the last several hundred years. So if you think about where the carbon is coming from over the long run, the Chinese contribution recently is significant, but it's the accumulation that's the thing. It's the long-term accumulation because it doesn't go away, driven by carbon production and pumping carbon up into the air for the purposes of capital accumulation and consumption in the capitalist world. Okay, so I just want to pump that theme a little bit more by pointing to a couple of things. Groundwater decline, very significantly, as Professor Chakrabarty referred to, very significantly driven by agriculture, by deep wells, tube wells in Punjab. Everyone probably realized that Punjab, the great heartland of Indian agriculture, is going to run out of water within the next couple of decades, probably. The wells go deeper and deeper and deeper, and the groundwater is not being recharged. And it's basically about overproduction of food for profit-making among capitalist farmers in Punjab, and where water is a private resource that is not taxed, where the cost of the water is the cost of the groundwater decline is not borne by anybody who's profiting from it. The Green Revolution and the privatization of resources is a tremendous source of environmental degradation, along with urbanization in general and the concentration of demand over drinking water in cities like Mumbai and Chennai and Los Angeles and places like that. These are huge urban concentrations of water consumption that are taking water from other places. This is where I want to end, which is that basically you have among these human relationships of ecological destruction, you have an incredibly important and underappreciated extent of spatial inequity and power over agriculture, over natural resources, where rich regions have demands over resources that are taken away from other areas, where the resources of one area are lifted out and used to enrich other areas, leaving the areas where they were taken from under destruction. So best example is the Narbada River and the dams on the Narbada River, destroying environments, displacing people, all for the benefit of farmers and urbanites in Gujarat. So that you have an incredibly important example, and there are many others, Israel and Palestine, of course, being an important example. You want to know what's going on there, just think about water, and there's various other examples in the world, okay? I want to refer finally to a wonderful quote from Professor Chakrabarty, who says global issues are local and local are global. And I just want to emphasize that these inequity issues are also both local and global. And I have a wonderful example that just came from a great talk on the basis of ongoing research by Sanjeev Barua, who basically says, who had a great argument, and he cites other people, but I didn't write down who he was citing, who basically the story is, the story is that global concern over carbon emissions creates a demand for greener technologies. One of the greener technologies is hydropower. Hydropower is being emphasized, and the plans and investments in big dams all along the Brahmaputra, in his case, in Arunachal Pradesh, are going on at a great pace. In other words, in order to protect the biosphere, they're going to destroy the ecosystems of the Brahmaputra basin. So that the spatial inequality there is both at a very global level and also, of course, inside of India, where the government of India can make plans to build these dams, despite the fact that they'll be destroying the environments of the people in this area. And I have lots of other examples. Shrimp cultivation, we love our shrimp. It's destroying environments all over the world for the purposes of consumers, all along the coastlines in Latin America and Africa and in Bangladesh, where many people are being displaced by shrimp farmers who are investing in very violent means and destroying ecosystems. And there are many examples, and thank you very much.
Admirably dense presentation, short, concisely delivered, from Friends of Nature.
Thank you very much. I feel extremely honored to be sitting with very well-respected scholars who work on environment history, which I don't claim to be one of them. That's not what my field is. But I'm very glad to actually make some contribution to this discussion from a practitioner's point of view. Environment history, to me, is really a history of, from Chinese education, is a history of conquering nature or fighting with natural disasters. But more and more, I see in China, environment history is going to be a history of detoxicating air, detoxicating water, detoxicating soil. Hopefully, we have some success doing that. And also, it's a history of trying to stay dry in the context of climate change. Or, sadly, it's going to be a history of trying to make enough clean water, clean food, safe food, clean soil, things like those, very basic elements that, in a very low expectation for human civilization, that we thought that it was set up to do more than just that. But I think we are struggling with just that. Judy gave a very interesting presentation about waging war against nature. But as a Chinese in secondary school education, we have learned that this very famous water skiing outside of Chengdu, which is called Dujiangyan. It's a dike that diverts water from Minjiang in order to boost the irrigation agricultural land of a huge area. And this system actually still works. It's more than 2,600 years. So, putting that in contrast to how we have continuously built dams on both sides of the Himalaya, which is this earthquakes concentrated area, is something that we mind-boggling for environmentalists. Something must be wrong. The traditional Chinese wisdom can be very well captured by this phrase: harmony between heaven and human, 天人合一. Before the scientific language of environment is introduced, I think in Chinese society, we don't talk about environment, we talk about nature and heaven. And heaven is a metaphor referring to the surroundings of human being, that it's a surrounding that you don't necessarily have control of, and you have to learn to live with it. But, from that value, from that recognition, all of a sudden, Chinese society launched wars against nature. And in a matter of 30 or 40 years, we are now in, again, a very different world. China has become the breadbasket of the world. And as the founder of Friends of Nature often says that, while we produce various food for the world, we mess up a huge kitchen. We mess up a huge kitchen that only Chinese people live up with. I think you also mentioned the point that the production, the globalized production system really connect everybody. So, the carbon emissions produced in China are related to many parts of the world, no matter in form of distracting natural resources by Chinese company from somewhere else, or leaving all the pollutions in China. Nearly 60% of the underground water is severely polluted. I have, from time to time, I don't have that much confidence in the quest for new innovation of scientific knowledge to actually clean up all those waters. If that doesn't happen, what we'll do for the 1.3 billion Chinese and many other people that are depending on the Chinese production these days. I think the final point I want to make is this. China, as well as the world, we make ourselves believe that we have embarked on this quest for sustainable development. And the emphasis is very much on development. It just needs to be sustainable. And so we create new technologies. For instance, just now you mentioned solar voltaic disk that were produced. That is called environmental as a user, but it's hugely unenvironmental from a producer's point of view. So in the global market, how do we evaluate that? Here's a short quote I want to share with you, if I can turn it on. It was from 300 BC. The Mencius, he wrote a conversation with the king. It goes like this. King Hui of Liang said, "Small as my virtue is, in the government of my kingdom, I do intend exert my mind to the utmost. If the year be bad on the Henei of the river, I remove as many people as I can to Hedong, the east of the river, and convey grains to the remaining population in Henei. When the year is bad on the east of the river, Hedong, I act on the same plan. On examining of the government of the neighboring kingdom, I don't find that there is any king who exerts his mind as I do, and yet the people of the neighboring kingdom do not decrease, nor do my people increase. How is this?" Mencius replied, "Your Majesty is fond of war. Let me take an illustration from war. The soldiers move forward to the sound of the drum, and after their weapons have been crossed, on one side, they throw away their coats and mail and trail their arms behind them and run away. Some run 100 pace and stop, some run 50 pace and stop. What would you think if those who run 50 pace were to laugh at those who run 100 pace?" I think the point I want to make is environmental history is really a mirror to human civilization that are facing enormous challenge today. A lot of technology that we name them green or environmental have to be questioned from the point of view of scientific knowledge and the scientific innovation and its relation with the society. Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you very much. We have quite a long time for discussion, about an hour, so up to an hour. What I'd like to do is perhaps just to give the panelists a brief opportunity to respond if they wish to the discussants, and then we could have a broader discussion and then come back to the entire panel, including the discussants, for further remarks and comments if they wish. Let me just add one question which was reverberating through my mind as I heard these very, very interesting observations, which is, which might have been implicit or imminent also in what the discussants both said, which is that of asking to what extent one can distinguish between the following two ideas in understanding the current global and local environmental crisis, and to what extent and what weight should one give to each of them? Not that they're mutually exclusive; they need not be, conceptually or empirically. The one is in some sense a change in our historical change in our relationship to nature, and I think Libo's comments about changes in cultural understandings and orientation were certainly suggested that, and that's a very important part of discourse on the environment. David Ludden's comments about capitalism also could be seen in that light, though they have a very different kind of a complexion. And to what extent do they have to do with scale? Scale of human populations, for example. We know that things that we celebrate, improvements in in reductions in morbidity and mortality rates, have the implication that people demand more. And it's not just that there's increasing affluence and greed, but it's also that there's an element of sheer unavoidability of the requirements in a capitalist or non-capitalist economic and social order of provisioning. We can see this, that even staple food grains, the food grains produced in the Punjab, for example, have very concrete implications with respect to groundwater depletion. And indeed, as Libo suggested, one of the major might have had in mind, one of the major contributions of India and China to global food security is that they have largely provided for their own sharply increasing needs through their own production. And so even if it were not true that neither country ever exported resources, the fact that they don't import allows countries which do import foodstuffs, for example in sub-Saharan Africa, to be able to do so with less competition. So it is a canard sometimes stated that India and China have contributed to rising world food prices through their demand. Quite the contrary is true, in the sense that their rapidly rising production has been able to meet their rapidly rising demand, and thereby enabled other countries' populations to better to be able to gain access to those limited resources which are available and produced in, say, Ukraine or Kansas. Now, the Ukraine, not the Ukraine, Ukraine. I was told once very clearly it's not the Ukraine, it's Ukraine, because the Ukraine suggests it's not a country, it's a region. So Ukrainian nationalists will tell you it's Ukraine, not the Ukraine. Unlike the Gambia, which remains a country and a region. Well, there it is. So there are these two different ideas. And to what extent and in what ways do we think that they are each important in understanding the current situation in the world? But let me turn to the panelists, perhaps in reverse order, in case they have anything to add. Professor Hughes?
Well, I appreciate the emphasis on water, and I might just add a note to that. I remember in one of the early environmental history conferences in Delhi, there was a great argument about how you should get water to the crops. And the argument boiled down to between irrigation and tube wells. And one of the issues that was very important in the discussion was salinization. That is, if you irrigate in an area where there is evaporation, you're going to get salt in the soil. So that is an issue also that occurs. And another note, this word sustainable, ever since it was introduced into the environmental discussion in the UN, it has been a word that covers a multitude of sins. That is, what do you want to sustain? Sustainable development, that indicates you're going to develop continuously, forever. Sustainable population, that could mean one number, but it could also mean a rise in population. And if you just think over the rational result of sustained population growth, you will have not only the Earth covered with human beings, but at some point all known space. So the sustainable environment, yes. Sustainable development, sustainable business, sustainable capitalism. Let's look at that word, sustainability, and be sure how we're using it and what we mean. Is it a desideratum or not?
Professor Shapiro?
Okay, maybe 2 or maybe 2.5 comments. David Ludden's comments about capitalism, I found myself much in agreement, and like this phrase, political economy of human control over nature. But I was reminded when Mao's War Against Nature first came out, I was a young scholar, and I organized one of my very first panels ever, and I had me and an historian from Russia, and two historians from Cuba. And we presented about the Stalinist degradation of nature. And our discussant was Donald Worster, who, of course, was apoplectic because he was, no, the root cause of environmental degradation is not Stalinism, it's capitalism. And so I wanted to maybe make even more clear than I did in my remarks that Maoism, in a way, was a modernistic ideology. It's about sort of the Enlightenment split, if you will, between people and nature. And so I don't think it's a question of ideology at all. It kind of gets to Sanjay's comments about, ideology versus scale, if you will, or maybe it's ideas versus material factors. We talk a lot in my courses about the IPAT equation and the inadequacy of the IPAT equation. IPAT equation is impact equals population times affluence times, or sometimes divided by technology, and that doesn't deal, that's a famous formulation from 1968 by the Ehrlichs, but it doesn't begin to deal with the politics of the locality and power inequalities, and lately we're talking about not global north and global south, but the global north in the global south and the global south in the global north. I don't know how responsive this is to your comment, but one last little comment is that Don Hughes mentioned that the Chinese environmental historians are doing a great job of translating the important works of environmental history. But I have to say that Dr. May, who was quoted as the person who's by Dr. Ludden, has organized her people at Beijing Normal University to translate my book, and it's been blocked by the standing committee, because it points the finger at Mao. So there really are a lot of limitations, shall we say, in what can and can't be discussed.
Mr. Chakrabarty.
I pick up the cue from David Ludden. And I agree with him that it is a case of human conflict. It's more a case of human conflict when it comes to the issue of climate change, water resource, or environmentalism as a whole. Take, for example, the concrete case of human-wildlife conflict. In the Sundarbans, in Bengal Delta, it is a national park. It is world's largest tiger reserve, the mangrove tiger land. And here, people live in the buffer areas of the national park, and we are hearing cases of repeated tiger-human conflict. And this tiger-human conflict is actually a reflection of the human-human conflict. There's a lot of poaching going on because tiger body parts can be sold all over the world. It has a very big international market. Tiger body parts would go to Nepal, and from Nepal to Lhasa in China, where they will be processed and then resold to the wider world. So it is a case of human-human conflict. You have local people involved, the poachers involved. I'm taking up this particular case because it will illustrate the actual problem, the pith and marrow of the problem. And the basic thing which emerges from this panel discussion and from what David Ludden argued at the end of our talk, it is indeed a case of a very contested space. We cannot agree what environmentalism is. Environmentalism remains as a very contested space. Yesterday, Professor Bauer was making a comment, and I appreciated it very much. He said, we all know what to do. You know, nature is governed by certain universal laws. We know the laws of nature. And if you disrupt it, you will have the fury. You will face the fury of nature. It's as simple as that. But it is such a contested space that you have different types of environmentalism. If you look at the typology of environmentalism in today's world, then you are really amazed. So it is not to be decided by political economy. It should have been decided by reason. But I'm afraid eventually the solution, although we know the solution would be a political solution. That is the sad side of it. I'm sorry to say this. We will return to the discussion. I hope I'll get another round, so I'll speak again.
Okay, definitely. So I'd like to invite the audience, not the audience, the participants in this august meeting to please raise questions and comments, and if possible to direct questions to particular persons. And I would like to invite the discussants also to consider themselves authorized and encouraged to also answer questions. Please feel free to direct questions to them too. So Professor Bawa, to start with, I believe there's a microphone which will come around, and I will register the other questions. I think at this stage we could take the questions one by one, but if time becomes an issue, we may collect a few. So to begin, Professor Bawa, please.
I don't have questions, but I have two comments. One is, and they are related comments. One is the critique of environmental history in South Asia, one often hears, is that the field remains very descriptive and is not sufficiently analytical to address contemporary environmental problems. And I think one of the reasons for that is, what David Ludden pointed out, and I think, Mr. Chakrabarty, you in your response mentioned the contemporary issue of human-wildlife conflict, because we are dealing with what people have called wicked problems that are going to require multiple approaches. And then in search for our solutions, to what extent we should continue to promote one particular field over the other. The second comment is that I find it I'm very curious that a lot of environmental history is captured in traditional ecological knowledge, and yet I find the two fields are developing in parallel, and there is very little confluence. And I think partly, again, I come back to the same point, to what extent we can keep talking about these disciplines as separate disciplines in addressing complex problems.
Anyone care to respond to that?
May I?
Please.
Thank you, Professor Bawa, for your very interesting question. Environmental history, it may not be a separate field. It is just an interdisciplinary field of study, maybe a recent offshoot of traditional history writing. But here is a point, you see, in environmental history, what the historians are doing, they are trying to historicize some of the environmental issues of present times. We are encountering the issue of climate change, depletion of natural resources, receding forest cover, and so on and so forth, loss of biodiversity. Now, you see, some of these things, they need to be historicized, and this historicization can be best done on the basis of documentary evidence available in archives by historians who have the training to deal with the archival documents. So, well, it is a bit descriptive, it is empirical, and perhaps we can take cue from the past, how the past societies responded to different environmental issues. And that is the role of the environmental historians. I'm a very conservative historian. I was trained as a professional conservative historian, but in environmental history also, I'm following a similar methodology that I pursued while doing conventional history, political history or diplomatic history. I think it's good to have a field like this. It is interdisciplinary. It's not only the historians who are into it, but we have people from different disciplines like geographers, botanists, geologists, sociologists, economists, all are welcome. So it is an open-ended field, and it's doing fine. It's quite robust in the world. And there are 3 international journals on environmental history. One is Environmental History, which is published from the United States. It is the organ of the American Association of Environmental Historians. Then you have Global Environment, which is published from Italy. And there is Environment and History, which is the organ of the European Society for Environmental History.
Environment and History.
Yeah, that's the European, based in Europe.
Environment.
Questioning the importance of the field. I myself very much subscribe to the field of
Yeah, I know.
believe in it. I'm just wondering, what you see the future trajectory of the field in terms of the problems we are facing.
Yes.
And where the priorities lie and that's
Right. I got it.
Anyone else care to respond? Maybe, please. Yeah.
I just thought I would respond to that, and also to a couple of other things that have been said, particularly Professor Hughes's querying of or underlining the ambiguity of sustainability, because I think that may be where some of your analytical rigor could be directed. So one way to think about sustainability that would be probably useful would be to think about it as the sustainability of human living environments. Okay, so in other words, that the sustainability of human living environments would then depend upon certain features of nature, environmental features that are there. And the reason why history would be relevant then would be you could actually study the extent to which the increasing demands of humans upon nature actually create situations where this increase in the demand begins to contradict the sustainability of the living environment that humans are in. Okay, so this is an interesting historical problem, and one of the things that you could say that where the historians would come in, and is that for a very long time, for thousands of years, if one environment became unsustainable, people could leave and they would go somewhere else. And so when the planet is thinly populated, and when populations can move around all over the place, that's exactly what they did. And agricultural frontiers expanded and expanded because population growth, new generations, new fields, open up the fields, keep moving out. And then all of a sudden there comes a time, and I think we may have reached that time. This is maybe goes to Sanjay's question about this question of what's the tipping point, what's changed, is that there came a point, and it's in the last 100 years, because in some places it actually started earlier. I have to say in India is one of them, where the degradation of the Deccan, for example, began to make the Deccan unsustainable in the 19th century. And the constant effort to make the Deccan more and more densely farmed has actually created a completely unsustainable ecological environment there. And I'm sure there's others in the world, but this is one I happen to know about. So historicizing the sustainability of human environments and the creation of a world in which there's nowhere to go anymore. There's no extensive frontier, and the intensive frontier that we've been relying on for the last 100 years or so has also begun to create an internal contradiction in the sustainability of human environments. I think that might begin to address the question of analytical rigor and put a little bit more clarity on the importance of the historical analysis as well.
So I think we have Sanjay at the back, Chaturvedi, Professor Sanjay Chaturvedi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Sanjay Chaturvedi, fellow, third cohort fellow. Looking at the figure up there, one feels that most of it is ocean. It's a blue planet. And I wonder whether there is some kind of a terrestrial bias in large accounts of environmental history. Where does the ocean figure? I know there is some body of literature. For example, I wonder what would be the potential insights, theoretical, methodological, and conceptual, of environmental history when it comes to the oceans. Take, for example, Indian Ocean, which is one of the most coherent ocean spaces. Sugata Bose very rightly calls it interregional space. So I was wondering whether the panelists would like to comment on this particular point. Thank you, Chair.
Please, Professor Hughes, yes.
I totally agree with this concern, and I find that many of my fellow environmental historians do too. It has been a concern that unfortunately has been late in developing, but now it's receiving considerable enthusiasm. There are conferences on it, people are writing papers, the environmental history of the oceans. And as you, oh, I'm so sorry.
Ocean?
Water. So, yes, where was I? Oh, it is 3/4 of the Earth's surface, and it definitely needs at least equal emphasis with the land if we're going to understand and get along with our whole Earth.
Dong Shikoi, please.
I'm Shikui Dong from Beijing Normal University. Actually, I have one comment for Professor Chadibadi. Actually, in China, we do not have plan to divert the water from Yalong to Western China. So that's maybe misled by the media. Actually, in China, the transfer water is just planned on the Yangtze River. There are 3 parts: eastern, middle, and western. Western part actually from headwater area of Sanjiangyuan. Yeah, that's a point. Okay, now I have a couple of questions to Professor Shapiru. I do agree with most of your studies and your findings, but still I'm curious about several questions. First one, when you look at the contemporary environmental problems in China, it is exactly repeats the way that Western countries did in last centuries, like during the industrial revolution in UK. So they have the dirty times and also kind of air pollution there. So nowadays we are facing the same problem. And also look at the environmental history in US here. You have also land degradation and Great Plain, which also relate to the development in your country. And when we talk about the logging or deforestation in Amazon, of course, US also take some kind of responsibility to that. So my question is, in China, we are like saying it is easier to say than to do. So what's your recommendations to China? First one, okay. Now second one. Second one is when you look at the carbon emission, in the history, Western countries produce a lot. It's still in the atmosphere. But my question is, why Western countries do not transfer the technology of carbon mitigation to those countries like India and China, free of charge? And 3, when you look at the scale globally, of course, China is just like a global factory, produce everything. But we also should ask where this goods go. Like I had the experiences of Black Friday. I just was in the line for 5 hours to get a pair of shoes. That's my experience here for the Black Friday. But when you look at the price of products here, it's much cheaper than in China. Even like in China, most of these brands even triples than here. And a lot of Chinese people, when I went to the Woodenberry, a lot of Chinese people went there and in the line to buy stuffs. So they will take plane, come to US and buy the stuffs and go back. That contribute a lot of carbon emission. So who should take the responsibility of this kind of global market in terms of carbon emission? That's my question.
Yeah, those are really useful comments because they actually recapitulate a lot of the arguments that you hear from the Chinese government and from the Chinese people. It's really very well expressed, very typical, if you don't mind my saying, line of thought. Okay, so one thing is that the Chinese government and some Chinese thinkers argue that China is just following the exact same road of development that the West did. So why shouldn't China be allowed to develop? They think China has an absolute right to develop. Yes, it's true. China does have an absolute right to develop, but there are some flaws in the argument, 2 flaws. One is the Chinese like to talk about an environmental Kuznets curve, yeah, where basically, as production goes up, then it levels off, and then it cleans up. So the flaw is that the planet can't bear for China to take the same route that we did. And now we have to change. This isn't about, oh, China's bad, China should change. Yes, it's our emissions. The carbon's up there from our industrial revolution. So we absolutely in the West have to, or developed North, have to change our behavior. And we have very little credibility right now with the developing world because we have not successfully changed our behavior. So I am very supportive of the Chinese position. But at the same time, I think we all have to recognize that as citizens of the world, not citizens of China or America or somewhere else, citizens of the world, we have to find a solution, because otherwise, the Chinese will have the terrible impacts of all of these things, and maybe more severely than we do in the West, because of a developing country is going to feel the impacts of things like climate change much, much worse. So let me see, you had 3. So one was this Kuznets curve question. The second was who should pay for the carbon. And in fact, as you know, they're in Doha right now, arguing again and being mad at each other. And, yes, it should be, technology should be transferred free of charge. But frankly, if it's not transferred free of charge, the Chinese are going to steal it anyway. So just to be confrontational back, if you want. So this is the build, operate, transfer, BOT model, which is the price of admission for many foreign companies in China. So, and what was I'm missing the second question was?
Producer and consumer relationship. Producer and consumer relationship.
Oh, yeah, okay. So this is actually, the Chinese are also very, very aware now that they're bearing the brunt of the world's pollution, and it's not fair. Yeah, so this is a very constructive movement in China. In the Ministry of Environmental Protection, they're starting to do analyses of exactly what percentage of the world's pollution the Chinese people are experiencing. And so with that kind of argument, then they can really work on changing China's production patterns. My concern is this. We talked about displacement of environmental harm. My concern is that as China rises and the people are not willing anymore to put up with this world's pollution breadbasket, as it were, then that pollution is simply going to move to more vulnerable populations in places like Africa, Cambodia, Indonesia. So until we really become sustainable and stop this notion that there is such a thing as growth that is not going to put us up against the limits of the world's resources, I think we're just going to keep on postponing what Li Bo was saying. Ultimately we have to start to just struggle to meet very basic needs and maybe revise our aspirations for what a good life is. Some kind of sacrifice may be necessary.
Professor Chakraborty.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to my Chinese friend. This is regarding the construction of dam on Brahmaputra. Are you denying that dam is there? We have satellite. Yeah, we have satellite images of those dams, and it is crystal clear that they are being constructed. Now, why? I feel very assured when you are saying that China has no such design. The problem is, the crux of the problem is that the Chinese government should be more transparent and come out with their objectives very clearly. Unless they do this, there will be more misunderstanding, more misgiving, and more media hype, as it has happened in the recent past regarding Brahmaputra water.
Dong, you had a very quick response you wanted to make, and I believe Jayanto has what is called in these parts a two-hand response sometimes, namely specifically on this issue. We'll come back to you for a general question, but I think first Dong, then Jayanto on this specific issue. We'll come back to you on the other matter. Yeah.
Sorry, just a quick response to Professor Shapiro. Do you think U.S. changed their attitude, behaviors, in terms of environmental friendly? Because I live here for 4 months. Every day, I just saw a lot of just like paper waste in the toilet, and also a lot of leftover were distributed on the street. And also, U.S. people drive such huge car. So, do you think they changed their attitude? That's my question.
We just wanted clarifications at this stage, but thank you, Dong.
Yeah,
and
Jayanto,
quick point on this issue. Yes, please.
I am a fellow of the third cohort also. I have questions on
we'll come back to you on
I would
general
like to specifically talk about the propaganda of water transfer from Zangbo and historical situation in northeastern India on that supposed water transfer. I've been working on Himalayan rivers for quite some time, and there is very little water, to the extent of 18 to 20%, that comes to the plainland Brahmaputra from China. There is about 80% of water of Brahmaputra that flows into the Brahmaputra Valley of Assam comes from Indian rivers which are in the south-facing slope of the Himalaya. Now, what is happening in that 20% is important but not central. Second is, it will need a huge economic loss for China to store that little water in Zangbo, Yalong Zangbo, and transfer it to where water is required, either to the east or to the west. To the east, you have much more water supplying rivers like Mekong, Salween, Irrawaddy, and only then Yalong. So it will really require a wild imagination to take the fourth distant river, to take its water to cross 3 bridges and then take it to the flatlands or Yangtze.
Put it into the Mekong.
And I admire those reporters in various Western press who write such articles.
Okay. Jayanto, we'll return to you about other questions I know you have.
It is such a fascinating topic that we always get carried out. So I think there is a dam, but there are 346 dams in the Brahmaputra in India, about which no one talks.
No, that's the way you're talking.
So I know, actually, I know, Mark, you have possession, and possession is sometimes thought to be 9/10 of the law, but I have Gina first, then this gentleman in front, then Mark, and then we'll see if there are any other questions. Thank you.
Hi, thank you. Oh, is this on? My name is Georgina Drew. I'm at the ICI as well. And I wanted to first thank you all for a really great set of presentations and discussion. It's been a very robust conversation. I guess one of the things that I was thinking about and pondering was, we have such great information. Environmental history has been wonderful at promoting kind of this historical arc that we can look at to see how things have, progressed over time and the challenges that we're facing. And Judith, you talked about, this also the looming question of futures. I also appreciated the point about Chakravarti and his 4 theses and kind of this idea that right now we're at a very special moment where we understand for the first time that not only do we affect the climate, but in a certain sense we are climate, right? That we are essentially part of the process of change and that the change begins with us. But one point of kind of uncomfort that I have is this, this assumption perhaps that knowledge, the information can change our behavior and more importantly our values. And so I'm wondering how we can interrogate that a little bit more. Judith, you talked about this new turn or resurgence within China, for instance, to look at Confucianism or Taoism or Buddhism. And I think that is an important part of readdressing the question of values. The only stickiness is that those those conversations are also not apolitical. Sometimes they're very politically charged. And in India, what we've seen is that the Hindu nationalists have also been very involved and important in some environmental conversations that we've been having. So, I want to just put out there how can these environmental histories help us get more clearly around the question of changing values, but also keep the politics on the table at the same time.
Okay. Any reaction?
I have a very brief response to this. I don't know. I'm not very sure if environmental history can really change our value system. But it can certainly generate more respect for the upcoming crisis or the ongoing crisis of climate change. There was very little time. I was trying to give emphasis on the traditional and historic understanding of South Asians and East Asians of the value of water. There is a profound understanding of the value of water in Asia, the point I was trying to harp upon. I mean, it is enmeshed in daily life and culture, as David Moss in his work, Rule of Water, has shown. Now, I mentioned 4 things, but I could not thrash all the points out. I was talking about a global teleconnection, historic teleconnection between the rise and fall of civilizations in the historic period. I mentioned the Harappan civilization. I mentioned the fall of the Ming dynasty in the 17th century. And then I wanted to mention the fall of the Ottoman Empire and the French Revolution. Interestingly enough, all the 4 events were fostered by a climate change situation. I mean, there was climate change in the sense that the entire pattern of monsoon, it crumbled down, and there was water shortage leading to drought and famine and outbreaks of rebellion. And it is a kind of a El Nino, global El Nino teleconnection about which Richard Grove has written at length. And if you know all these, then what happens, you see, it only indirectly affects our culture, and we start respecting the ongoing crisis of climate change. You see, we are not doing anything. We have not done anything yet. We are burning more vigorously the fossil fuels. Yesterday I was telling you that 5,000 years ago, the Greeks started burning fossil fuels, and we are very proudly doing it today, even after 5,000 years. That's a sad story. So you see, you can take certain cues from history. That is the thing environmental history can do. We cannot have direct impact on policy formulation.
Sanjay, can I have a short?
Please, yeah.
I'm readily converted that maintaining our spiritual relations with nature is very important. But at the same time, I'm also trying to compare and without an answer. Chinese society for the last 60 or 70 years have been, atheist space. And we waged wars on nature. Take example of here, USA. Religious freedom is to a large extent respected, but you would imagine the relationship with nature or the spiritual relations would be very different, and it would enhance the sustainability reflexation. There is Native Americans, and there is I happened to see a documentary that New Age people, Native Americans, and the majority of people, they clash on lands. And and also India, I visited India. I think India is culturally diverse and religious. There are a huge space for religious expression. But I don't see there is very coherent consideration for nature and the relationship with nature in face of fast development. So what is at work? That's my question.
Mm-hmm. Can I add one more thing, too? Yeah.
I think briefly, because there are a number of questions, so if you just take a minute each, please.
The Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism thing is small. It's more like a wish. It's not. And among young environmentalists, I think there's more interest in global civil society and what their counterparts are doing internationally. But to an extent, we could look at communism, you know, scientific socialism as the state religion, okay? So in that sense, we have to look at what are they saying about science and sustainability and sustainable development and see what is the role there. And there's a little risk, I think, a big risk, that the Chinese government and policymakers, although they see environmental issues as critical to deal with, see them as technocratic, technological. You know, every time I'm invited to go to China to speak on environmental things, they take me to schools of science and technology. You know, it's not considered a school for political science or international relations. So that's, you know, a real problem.
Sanjay, can I just say one thing?
I think Professor Hughes, please, was also wished to. So, and then Professor Ludden, yeah.
One of the problems that we have as historians is that these questions deal with the future. And, well, for example, when Gro Harlem Brundtland defines sustainable development, she said it's to meet the needs of the present without endangering the needs of the future. And most environmental issues have this dimension. Now, my fellow historians, looking at me as an environmental historian, we have an expression, we have an expression, shoemaker, stick to your last. So that's historians, stick to your past. History only deals with the past. We have no documents from the future, you know, maybe fortunately. But that doesn't excuse us from asking these questions. We can indeed say some things about the future. We can look at present trends and extrapolate them. An environmental historian gives us, environmental history gives us another dimension. It gives us experience that we have uncovered, you know, from the past. It gives us a certain depth with these questions so that we are analyzing them and we're not just talking off the top of our heads.
David, please.
I just wanted to say that the question of values, I think it's already been said, but the question of values I don't think should be thought of in terms of religion. Hindutva, concern with the environment is entirely at the expense of the Muslim population of India. So let's not confuse these things. And besides, Hindutva is not religion anyway. It's just politics. So I think that probably, if I were to say, would there be a value that would be environmentally important, it would be equity. It would be an egalitarian type of value system, because an awful lot of the stealing from the future for the present is to enrich a small percentage of the population. And the enrichment of the small percentage of the population is actually a very important driving force in the unsustainability of the environment for everyone. So if the value system were reorganized in such a way, and it could be done in purely secular terms, so as to put egalitarian kind of values at the forefront of resource allocation and so on, I think it would have a huge effect. But this is not doesn't seem to be in the playground right now. I'm sorry to say.
We have only a quarter of our discussion time left, and I've seen a large number of hands. I know that you have a microphone also, but I'm sorry, I have registered a few here. So if it's all right, I'd like to just take maybe 4 questions now and I could take them all, but that might overload the speakers.
Take the whole.
Take them all?
Comments instead of questions.
Well, if you can keep track, if your memories are so capacious and you are people with large brains and no doubt very commendable such capacities in that regard, then fine. But we only have 15 minutes, so we'll take all the questions then by acclaim of the discussants and speakers.
I have a very simple question. Very simple.
Well, actually, I'd like to go in the order I've
Okay,
registered the questions. At least let's maintain that degree of procedural regularity. So, first of all, I believe I have the gentleman right here. Yes. You have been, I know. I've registered you at the beginning, please.
Thank you. My question may be small because some of the questions have been as long as the presentation, so I will try to make it very brief. First question primarily addressed to Professor Ludden, and the secondarily Dr. Chakrabarty. Second question is for Shapiro. Brief question. First question, again, about water, the precious commodity, the precious thing. We have to find an effective, efficient mechanism or machinery for its equitable distribution. You addressed it very, very eloquently. And within India, there are conflicts between humans and environment, and among humans also. When it comes to international thing between India and Pakistan, between India and Bangladesh, you touch upon that, there is conflict. So when it comes to problem within India, two examples. The first one you mentioned, the Narmada.
Please be brief. Huh?
Yeah,
we have
the Narmada,
very short time now.
The Narmada project. Where do you draw the line? How to make the system of distribution efficient? Would you agree that if it is beneficial to 90% of the people, hurting 10% of the people is okay? And when it comes to the Kaveri river, that is between Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, is an ego clashing more of an ego clashing than they are not looking for efficient thing. And when it comes to disputes between countries, India and Pakistan, India and Bangladesh, the constant complaint we hear from Bangladesh is that India has been blocking water during the time they need it badly, as a result causing drought. And they releasing water when they don't need it and resulting in floods. So how is there any truth in that complaint? You could take up that. And the second question for Shapiro, there is a complaint within China that that Bund region is sinking. It's based on evidence. Are the Chinese authorities doing anything about it? Thank you.
Okay. Professor Fraser, Mark Fraser. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, very briefly, I wanted to echo some of the other questions and comments about, and this gets to what are the political drivers currently of what we call environmental movements or resistance to developmentalism and developmentalist ideology. Professor Liboa mentioned Dujiangyan, these very historical waterworks or aqueducts in Sichuan near Chengdu. And it was only, 10 years ago that this place was also indeed slated for dam building. But thanks to mobilization using the media, lots of NGOs, including his and others, the project was canceled. And so, people have looked at this and said, well, it's not there was no religious tradition that was being threatened, but it was kind of a national identity, a national landmark that was being threatened. And this was therefore a very successful mobilizational frame by which the dam wasn't built. So the extension of that little story is that, what values or political forces do you all see at work today in India or in China that would lead for there to be mobilization against the projects of the state and its officials and corporations to continue with this very unsustainable manner of development?
Professor Srinivas.
I'm rather intimidated by both the people who have asked questions before me and the ones who will ask questions after, so I shall be very, very brief. All of your presentations actually are at one level on historiography. My question is very simply, what do you feel is promising at the moment in the way in which environment history is being discussed and written? So my question is really gesturing towards a sort of a critical view of how environment history is currently understood.
Jayanta Bandyopadhyay, Professor Bandyopadhyay.
I go back to the title of this session when we discussed. We had the last session was ecology, and this was history. We specifically mentioned history and not environmental history. I think my question is a request from to the panel for a response that by identifying environmental history as a subdiscipline, we are probably keeping alive a very partial as well as a reductionist development of academic activities in the overall discipline of history. We can have political economic history, which is the dominant. How is the possibility you see of integrating environment, transforming history as a more comprehensive interdisciplinary subject of research?
So this side of the room? Yes, finally, on this side. Yeah, please.
How successful is the trading of carbon rights in the UN to help mitigate pollution? And countries are trading rights, for development and not for development. Is that something that should be continued? Is that successful? Is that noteworthy? Is it program or?
How successful?
Here, yes, in front.
Carbon rights, trading of the carbon rights, is it successful? It's too much too early.
Is it on? Okay, thank you very much. I didn't introduce myself yesterday, so I should. I'm Charles Zerner. For better or worse, I'm trained as a lawyer and an architect. I've done work in Southeast Asia and Indonesia on environmental issues and indigenous rights to forests and water. And my question is basically, well, first I want to thank the panel for making such learned and distinguished contributions, and I want to express a word of appreciation for Dr. Ludden's comments. I can't tell whether you remind me more of Obama's plea about unfairness or whether you're actually an avatar of David Harvey injecting political inequity into the discussion, but thank you very much. Okay, and here's the question, which is this. I hear echoes continually throughout the discussion of what to me is now an old and either venerable or hoary preoccupation with the question of environmental limits. In fact, there's an allusion in many of the discussions to the global public sphere arriving at a conviction that we're at a threshold moment in the recognition that the split that Cronin brought our attention to between the natural, the wild, and the human is not only conceptually invalid, but it's materially fallacious that we human beings saturate the world of nature. Nature is not other. So here's my question. It's a question not about metaphor, but it's a question about narrative. Aren't we actually playing with, deploying the image of the environment as an object which cannot, which can be extinguished, which can be exhausted, which is finite, versus what I would submit, or at least I'm inviting your comment on it, a capitalist notion of the environment as an infinite object of development, that there is always a frontier, whether it's at the macro level of resources or the level that I'm focusing on, which is Defense Department manipulation of the microbiological, the molecular. I would submit that the frontier narrative is absolutely growing, expanding, and never stopping. And it's funded by Big Pharma on the one hand, and the Defense Departments, whether we're talking about South Asia.
If we could just wrap up, we have only 5 minutes left.
Southeast Asia or the North. Okay, so it's a question.
Thank you. Okay, there's one last question, I believe. No, I didn't see any other hands unless I'm wrong. So please, this is the last question, I believe. Okay.
Yeah, I'm interested in repairing for decisions made hundreds and hundreds of years ago. I've just learned Peking was built in an environment that can't sustain it. No food, no water, no transportation. How about Chicago? There's no commerce on the Great Lake. They had to lift the whole city up 17 feet and dig ditches to connect it to water. That's our second largest city. Salt Lake City, God said, let's build a metropolis here. We did. No sense to an environment. And Phoenix in the desert is really ridiculous. I wonder if India has anything like that. Or is India such a rich and fertile area that no one ever made an arbitrary decision? Perhaps military they did and built it. But I'm curious.
Thank you very much.
I missed the first part of your question.
Deciding to locate cities and it doesn't connect with nature. arbitrary.
I just want to note that we have only 4 minutes left. So in consideration of the panelists, I suggest we go for an extra 5 minutes, which will give them each roughly 2 minutes to answer, or if necessary, 3 minutes. There is lunch outside the hall, I believe, which everyone is invited to after we finish the discussion. So I'd like to turn to the panelists, maybe in the order they spoke, and ask them to please try and keep themselves to 2 minutes, and maybe our timekeeper could be mobilized in this regard. But if you have to take 2.5 minutes, we probably will
I'll take
have to
2
live
minutes.
with that. Yeah, please.
I'll take 2 minutes, and I'm sorry I may not be able to respond to all the questions or interjections. I'll respond to Professor Bandyopadhyay's comment. I thought at least I can speak for myself. I am doing history, conventional history. You see, these are all labels: environmental history, political history. They are labels of convenience, not labels of essences. So I have no quarrel with this. If someone wants to brand it as environmental history, he or she is free to do that. But I believe that I am a historian. I have the training of a formal professional historian, and well, it's not environmental history. I'm doing history. That is my response to you, and you are right. I mean, various things are done under the heading of political economy, agrarian history, irrigation, which are also environmental history. And I don't know to whom I am responding when I say that I don't think that sustainability is a very viable argument. Nothing is sustainable in this world, and with the expansion of the world, with the multiplication of the global population, with the explosion in demographic pattern, this concept of sustainability will collapse. It's just a matter of time. I just give you a concrete example, and you think for yourself. You see, medical science is going to lead us to a stage of abolition of death. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this idea of abolition of death, but our time will come sooner or later. We may not live to see that, maybe 50 years down the line at the most, when death will be abolished. And you know, once we reach that stage, the whole question of sustainability would collapse, and we have to think everything in a new light. Thank you.
Thank you. Please be alert, timekeeper. Thank you, Professor
Okay,
Shapiro.
I'm going to be real short, too. I'm Shanghai, I don't know. That's easy to answer. I don't know. We should find out. I'm most interested in this question of the political drivers of environmental resistance. And my sense is that ever since the campaign to save the Tibetan antelope, it's been sort of a question of where is the political space. So the Tibetan antelope was okay because all the poachers were Tibetan, right? The current attacks against the multinational corporations' suppliers are also more or less okay because we're dealing with foreign companies. Then you get these really vulnerable, poor rural villages like the cancer villages. There's very little political power, and that will require some activists, like the AIDS activists who spend so much time in jail, to come down and sort of try to raise the visibility of that. But often there's this fatalistic kind of sense that there is no political power. And then you also get a situation where it's more a rising middle class, like the PX factories, where there may or may not be an alliance with the professional environmentalist. But basically the middle class is saying, forget about it. So you get these people taking a walk. We didn't talk too much about Twitter and those kinds of filters, but one of the ways that protests are organized, as you know, is that rather than saying, let's go protest this, say, let's take a walk. And then you can't filter that. And everybody's out there taking a walk. And the government goes, ooh, there's a problem here. Yeah, it's a good question. We can talk about it more. UN process, some people are totally fed up, but it sort of drags on, and I don't think we can afford to give up completely. And that may be one vehicle whereby technology can be transferred free of charge. Hello, free of charge technology transfer through the UN system. Yeah.
Well, the theme that I wanted to pick up on was this thing of isn't it all right for countries that haven't reached the level of affluence of the United States or Europe to follow the same arc? And the thing is, well, we did it, and we did it in a bad way, and we messed up the environment, and we're sorry, right? And you should be able to find a better way to do it, not just follow us, you know, and then it's doing it to the whole world. They've measured the levels of pollution in California, and they have discovered that a significant portion of the air pollution there comes from China. You know, there are ways you can check the chemicals to see where they came from. And now, you know, if you're not cutting down trees there, this applies to Japan too, you're cutting the tropical forests all over the world, and we're all suffering the additional carbon that that puts into the atmosphere, and the removal of the photosynthesis. And, well, I could go on, but in view of time, I think I should stop.
There's too much. This was a great conversation. I really liked it. I want to really just respond to what Charles said, and other things will be related to that, which is that the idea of an infinite frontier is a very, very interesting one, but I'm afraid that it is one that is highly uneven in its ability to benefit people. So that the infinite frontier is one that some people will be able to benefit from and lots of people won't be able to benefit from. And this relates to the question of environmental politics or environmental justice movement in the United States, is that there's a question of harm, and then there's the question of responding to environmental harm. It's how people respond to the expansion of, shall we say, exploitation of human environments. What kind of capacities are there politically to respond to that? And I think that there's a lot of different possibilities. I don't think it's just one set of things. I think there's maybe a beginning of a multiplication of different possibilities at all different levels of scale, including the UN, but including lots and lots of local movements that might not even be thought of as environmental movements at all. And I could go into great detail because it's a very interesting case of the struggle against the expansion of shrimp cultivation in the Sundarbans, actually, in Bangladesh, where it's an example of just very low-key, completely publicized struggles for people to turn land from a very totally unsustainable and completely exploitative mode of land use back to rice cultivation, which is much more sustainable for those people. So the expansion of the shrimp frontier may be infinite, but it's damaging other people's livelihoods, and that's where the problem lies.
Quickly respond to the gentleman who talked about the decision-making for the location of the cities. For what I know, in China, probably such problem exists when we want to improve a city or enlarge the cities. Typically in Beijing, the architect actually, the parents of the founder of Friends of Nature, they actually suggested to build a new city on the side of the old towns of Beijing, but such idea were persecuted, and they personally suffered enormously from that suggestions, and the city grow at the cost of destroying the old, this idea of learning from the failed experiences is a very interesting one. The small towns are growing in China, and I'm always curious why they don't learn from the bigger cities. The mistake, for instance, the building the sewage system. You would imagine they would build a good sewage system so that they don't need to repeat and dig it up after things are built. But the same mistakes are made again and again. I've run into many new towns in China that I kind of feel sympathetic. When you have a certain amount of money, you want to build the house on the ground, or you want to build something that you cannot see underground? And what is the political and economic processes to make sure that they build underground before they build the house on top? And I recently traveled to Burma, and I could imagine the same mistakes, the same kind of environment problem is going to happen, for sure. Who is to say United Nations, World Bank, or bilateral agencies who will grow like mushroom, like crazy in Burma, are they going to tell Burma government, build your zoo first before you build the building on the top? So, there are a lot of challenges that we don't seem to learn and don't seem to cope well. I don't have the answer.
So we resume at 2 o'clock. Thanks to all of you for a very worthwhile discussion.
It's because people don't use it, right?